Okay, one of the things that we should talk about is U.S. power and influence in Latin America. So let's just say that the U.S. at first was looked favorably as a model of political virtues and moral enlightenment, and this occurred as Latin America is vying for independence. But once it got it, eventually it started to feel threatened by the Colossus of the North. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Let's just look at how that came to be. In the 1820s, Spain plotted to recover its American colonies or assets that it had lost. And Britain opposed this. They did not want to unsettle their new trade relations and asked the U.S. to join in opposing any new colonization in Latin America. President James Monroe did not really want to get entangled with Britain, but he also did not want colonization in the Americas. He wanted a buffer zone. So he established the Monroe Doctrine, which states that the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for any future colonization by any European powers. So you'll see this line here in the cartoon. It's an imaginary line separating the Americas from Europe. And it's basically saying we're off limits. So Europe was not happy, but we were supported by the British Navy. And that they just had a strong Navy, and our military was not as strong at that time. And we kept this bit of policy for over a century. Cuba and the Spanish-American War. Cuba struggled to be free of Spain, and the U.S. allied with Cuba to crush Spain. The peace treaty that occurred after the Spanish-American War awarded Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific Ocean to the U.S. And then in 1901, the U.S. forced Cuba to add the Platt Amendment to the Constitution, which basically gave the U.S. naval bases in Cuba and the right to intervene in Cuba's affairs when the United States felt it was necessary. So you basically don't get help for free, I guess, is the moral of the story. The United States helped Cuba fight Spain in the Spanish-American War, and then it expected something back. Now, just to add to our interventionist policy, which is something that we just pursued, is the Roosevelt Corollary. And basically, U.S. investment in Latin America increased, and to protect those investments, the Roosevelt Corollary was added to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine says no countries from Europe can come over and try to colonize any of the Americas. Those days are over, right? The Roosevelt Corollary basically claims that the United States is sort of an international police power in the Western Hemisphere, that we will protect the Western Hemisphere from any type of encroachment. But it also kind of assumed an intervening role in Latin America that they were not always pleased with. So when the Dominican Republic failed to pay its foreign debts, the United States sent in troops. Americans collected customs duties, paid off the debts, and then remained there for years. The U.S. acted similarly and sent in troops to Cuba, Haiti, Mexico, the Honduras, Nicaragua, and other Latin American countries as deemed necessary. So here you see Theodore Roosevelt with his Monroe Doctrine canon. We're going to look at the Panama Canal. Since the late 1800s, the U.S. desired a canal that traversed Panama and Central America. The benefits of this would be that warships could move between the Atlantic and Pacific and protect coastlines on both sides. It would also shorten shipping routes, and that would decrease trade cost. Of course, building the Panama Canal was a monumental and expensive task. Panama had belonged to Colombia, who refused to sell. So, the U.S. backed a revolt by Panamanians against Colombia. Panama won independence and gave U.S. control of the land and the area in which the U.S. wanted to build the canal. And construction began in 1904 and lasted until 1914. This really boosted trade and shipping worldwide. It cut the distance between cities by thousands of miles. But sometimes Panama was resentful that we had control of that area, and we controlled the land and the canal until 2000. So it's now a vital part of the Panamanian economy. Here you see the globe, and you see North America and South America below it. And the lines in red show shipping navigation prior to the canal. So if you wanted to reach New York from San Francisco, you had to go all the way around South America if you were going by ship. With the Panama Canal, you can see the distance is shortly decreased because they can cut through Central America and go up to the opposite coast, the opposite ocean. So here you see some of the building projects, and you can see it's just going to be enormous. Okay, so part of the Americas is Canada. Canada also achieved self-rule from Britain. So originally it was colonized by the French, and then in 1763 the British took over, but there were still thousands of French-speaking Catholic settlers. And more English-speaking settlers came in after the American Revolution. About 30,000 British loyalists fled to Canada. They spoke English and tended to practice Protestantism. And an ongoing rivalry has remained from that time. And also there were, Native Canadians that lived there, and they are referred to as First Nations people. So the Constitutional Act of 1791 created two provinces for English-speaking Canada, which was Ontario, and the French-speaking Lower Canada, Quebec. And the intent was to reduce tension. Each Canada had its own laws, legislature, and royal governor, but unrest continued to grow. They actually had a common issue. The English in Upper Canada, the English-speaking Canadians, resented British control. And so did the French-speaking part of Canada, Lower Canada. So both groups rebelled. And the Brits did not want another American Revolution. They learned from that experience. So what they did is they sent Lord Durham to compile a report of the causes of unrest. And then in 1840, the Parliament passed the Act of Union and joined the two Canadas and gave it an elected legislature to determine their own domestic policy. And Britain controlled foreign trade and policy still, but at least domestic control was under the United Canada. So Canada expanded just like the United States westward throughout the 1800s. And two Canadians, John Macdonald and Cartier, urged a confederation or a unification of British settlements in North America. So Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, British Columbia, as well as United Upper and Lower Canada. They wanted all of these areas to merge. They hoped a confederation would strengthen Canada against possible U.S. domination and also maybe help to develop its economy. So in 1867, Britain agreed and passed the British North America Act and created the Dominion of Canada. And a dominion is basically a self-governing nation. So ask yourself, why do you think Britain was quicker to give Canada, Australia, and New Zealand self-rule before its colonies in Africa or Asia? So, just continuing, Canada's first Prime Minister encouraged expansion and to unite the large territory. He advocated for a transcontinental railroad, which happened in 1885. The Canadian Pacific Railway opened, linking the East and the West, and settlers followed that. So as this transcontinental railroad opened and there were more stops, there were also more settlers in regions that before were more remote or sparsely populated. This improved transport of goods and people, but it also destroyed a way of life for the native peoples who were forced to sign treaties giving up their land. So one of the Métis people, which is just basically a mixture of Native and European people with Native and European ancestry, he led a revolt in 1869 to 1885 against Canada's westward expansion into Native American land. And the government forces did defeat both uprisings. So in late 1800s and early 1900s, one thing that did happen is that immigrants flooded into Canada from Germany, Italy, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, China, and Japan, and diversified it a little bit. And in 1914, Canada was a flourishing independent nation. Now, there still were tensions between the French and English-speaking Canadian, and that's just something that's always sort of being negotiated. Maybe a bit of a fear that the U.S. exerts a strong economic and cultural dominance just because we're so close by. But it is doing quite well. So, the one thing that I do want to revisit, because I did not show you the map, is that we talked about the Mexican-American Wars that occurred between 1846 and 1848. And I just want you to be clear on the fact that Mexico ended up losing about 50% of its land. It lost, either part or all of present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. And not a lot of people know that. So on this map, you see the United States over here. We eventually get the Louisiana Territory. We get this Oregon country was called Oregon country. But all of this area in yellow was part of Mexico. So Mexico lost a lot of territory. For this map, the yellow represents all of Mexico at that time. So it did keep what is present-day Mexico, and then the area above it, New Mexico, Arizona, a large part of California, Utah, etc., was ceded to the United States in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.